G'day guys, and today I want to chat a little bit about male suicide in Australia. Now I was pushed to talk about this rather grim topic, this rather mortal topic, as currently in my circle of friends and extended people I know on Facebook, there's a post going around and you share a photo of yourself and you copy and paste what's written there talking about male suicide and tag all your friends attempting to raise awareness and this sort of thing. And so that got me thinking about male suicide in Australia, something I haven't thought about for a little bit. And obviously I wanted to do some of my own writing in addition to the copy paste. It just felt a bit lame and low effort to just do that. And obviously that got me thinking. I've been tempted to chat to people, get their thoughts on this and this sort of thing, and I figured I'd share some of this information with you all too. So male suicide in Australia is, as I said, basically the problem for men in Australia. It's well, we'll get into the statistics. In 2017, the number of deaths from intentional self-harm stood at 3,128. Of these lives lost, 2,349, or 75%, were men, according to the Bureau of Statistics. And if you do the grim mathematics on that, that accounts to 6 men per day, or 1 man every 4 hours. So you go to work, you do an 8-hour shift. Tragically, 2 lives have been lost in that time. So yes, as I was saying, this isn't an insignificant problem. This isn't something that should be swept under the carpet. This is something that we really need to be talking about. Suicide is the leading cause of death in Australian men aged 15 to 44. Now this is an age bracket that probably encompasses most of you. And this is a death toll that is more than double the national road toll. Now Australian roads can be pretty dangerous, especially the country roads. You've got the 3 big killers are speed, fatigue and drink driving. But as bad as that is, and the amount of attention that receives, this is twice as bad. So we get into the interesting statistics. Well, interesting is not the right word, but the pertinent statistics will say that men are 3 times more likely to take their own lives than women in Australia. And again, this is just Australian data, but it's probably at least similar to what's going on in your country. And there is this problem, this very real problem that men who are having mental health issues, who are feeling suicidal, don't reach out and speak to mental health services. They don't seek help. Essentially, they just attempt to take on the world by themselves. And this is a huge problem. This is what campaigns like what was posted on Facebook and others are attempting to alleviate. So as well as not asking for help when feeling suicidal, a staggering 72% of men don't seek help for mental health disorders. We have data from Sane Australia saying the amount of people who call up asking for help, there's a ratio of 3 to 1 of women to men. So essentially for every man that calls up, there's 3 women have called up. So we can obviously see that women are far more willing to engage with mental health services, whereas men are not. So instead, research shows that most men turn to alcohol, drugs, gambling, and other unhealthy activities in a bid to cope with their emotions. Now this is a big problem. This is seen as sort of the driving factor behind male suicide, this idea that men won't go out and chat to mental health services, attempt to get help for themselves and this sort of thing. And this is really what I want to chat about today, because I don't think we quite understand or quite willing to engage with the way sort of men think and the way men are in the biological evolutionary sense. And so I want to chat about a bit about that today. I came across a quote in a book that I want to relay to you today. So the book said, one of the basic rules of evolutionary psychology goes something like this. And this is something that I've touched on quite a bit in a lot of other videos when I'm chatting about porn and being overweight and this sort of thing, but this really does encompass what I'm trying to get across. So it says, a need shaped in the wild continues to be felt even if it is no longer necessary for survival and reproduction. So that's what I'm getting at when I'm talking about leftover biology, leftover behavioral traits, and this sort of thing. So what we've got to think about with men with regards to this quote is male evolution, obviously. So what men have been selected for is competition. And I've chatted about that before in the channel before. Men are insanely competitive with each other, in group, out group, and this sort of thing, men have been selected to compete in a competency hierarchy. So that's essentially how men were able to reproduce back in the day. You demonstrate your competency, and that attracts women and this sort of thing. And this continues obviously on today. Just the myriad forms of what competency takes is different, throughout history as cultural changes and this sort of thing. But obviously we've reached a stage as a society and a culture where things are pretty comfy, and it's not such a Spartan, dire race for survival and this sort of thing anymore. So we can see how this extreme need to be competent and not show weakness, not show vulnerability, and all this sort of thing is a little bit unnecessary nowadays, because it's not, it's quite strictly speaking not as necessary to be so stoic, to be so unadmitting of problems, projecting an aura of strength and this sort of thing, because the social safety net is there. And that's just, not when I'm speaking about the social safety net, that's not just about, social services. I'm talking, health and sanitation, diet is up. You're not going to die. It's a lot harder to die nowadays than it was in the past. But still, because biology evolves so slowly compared to culture, men are still, I won't say stuck, but in this sort of mental state, and they will be for the rest of our lifetime, for hundreds of thousands of years, because evolution is just that slow, as they have been for many hundreds of thousands of years. Men are set in this way of competing in a competency hierarchy. A dominance hierarchy is another term you may have heard for it. So what does this mean? This means that men are not going to be, and this is a generalization, individual men can be different. Men are not going to be vulnerable in front of just anyone, because again, showing vulnerability is a detraction against your sense of competency. So if you're viewed as not being competent, well, you're not going to be able to reproduce. So men who are willing, and again, individuals vary, blah, 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 but as a general rule, men who are willing to be vulnerable and show their vulnerability to the world, they weren't considered competent. They didn't get to breed. They didn't pass on the genetics. Men who didn't, men who sort of were stoic, who hid their vulnerabilities, who attempted to deal with it themselves and within their own little individual group, they were the ones who were considered competent and able to pass on their genetics. And this, takes course over hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of years, and we end up where we are here today. And we end up with this, very useful set of biological skills, biological resources, but we don't so much need them anymore. And it's very similar to what I've chatted about before with porn and gorging on food and this sort of thing. These evolutionary traits that evolved for a reason over hundreds of thousands of years and were once very useful in the past, no longer are so necessary for our survival and reproduction, but we're still stuck with them. We have to deal with their ramifications. Things just don't go away because we have, a nice place to live, a nice society, clean water, and this sort of thing. So men aren't just going to be vulnerable with anyone. The way that I've been thinking about in a comparison is like an athlete. So athletes are obviously competing with one another, as men are. And, an athlete, when he comes up to the track, doesn't show his vulnerabilities to everyone. He sort of just, sets himself and gets on with his job. And it's the exact same with men. Men have a job. The job is to be competent. Generally speaking, when you boil it right down, the job is for men to be competent and gather resources. Well, if men feel like this, their sort of job is hampered by them being vulnerable with everyone, well, they're not going to do that, are they? And again, this isn't necessarily valid anymore. It isn't necessarily necessary, but it is what's occurring. And to refuse to acknowledge this, to attempt to just go around this and just sort of scratch your head and wonder why men won't help themselves, well, you're not going to be doing much favors for men now, and this is reflected in the numbers that I spoke of earlier. So yes, as I mentioned before, and I'll just recap this, Sane Australia, which is a mental health source, reports that in terms of people engaging with our support services, the ratio is 3 women for every 1 man. And I hope I've been able to sort of give you an idea of why that might be so. Men will not be vulnerable with just anyone. However, and this is the big however, men are perfectly capable and perfectly willing of being extremely vulnerable, staggeringly so, with people that they trust, their sort of inner circle and this sort of thing. And I think we all know this. I think we've had situations in our life where we're perfectly capable of opening up to our close friends, our close family, partner, and this sort of thing. We know what this is like. All men go through this at some point. I remember what this is like. Speaking with my friends really helped me out when I was feeling sad last year and this sort of thing. So we know that this happens. Men just don't attempt to deal with things on their own unless they feel like they have no trusted inner circle. So if men are alienated and isolated, then they're going to try and go things alone, and that's obviously not going to work out. And you can probably see some incredibly dire examples of this online. Obviously, the internet is a great tool in helping men feel connected, but there is that lack of interpersonal connection. Speaking to someone over the internet, especially through text, really just lacks that sort of interpersonal back and forth, reading people's facial expressions, body language, and this sort of thing. And this doesn't help men in remaining happy as so much as a personal conversation, a face-to-face chat with a good friend, and this sort of thing. So, men being upset. Let's chat about that. The way I see it, and again, this is my opinion, something that I've read that seems valid. When men are upset, they retreat into themselves. That's the opposite to women, who prefer to share their problems. Again, generally speaking, individuals vary. Men will retreat into themselves. They will retreat into the man cave, or just the cave. Now, what occurs here is that anyone who tries to go into the cave after the man to help him, and they're obviously already very well intentioned, when when someone wants to help you out and they pursue into this cave, men retreat even further into the cave because this well-intentioned helping is seen as an attack upon their competency. Whereas the person who's trying to help out is just saying, oh, look, I'm here to help. The man, whether consciously or subconsciously, sees that as you're too weak to help yourself and you need help. You need a subsidy. You're just too weak and vulnerable to do this by yourself. You're incompetent, you're unable to handle the situation, and you're pathetic and weak. So obviously men retreat further and further. And this can be very confronting, I feel, for a partner who, thinks they, obviously men and a man and his partner have a very close bond, but it may not necessarily at all times, in all places, be willing to let that woman into the cave after him. And again, circumstances vary, and I understand this sort of thing. But it may be confronting to a partner to see that when a man obviously retreats. And this could be physically. You may, walk off to his room, she comes in after him, and he just says, go away. This sort of thing. And that can be very confronting and cause its own problems within a relationship. Now, the way a man exits the cave is that he attempts to solve problems. And these are obviously little problems at first. And this is something, once I've read, I've started doing very consciously in real life. So when I have some big problem in my life, some big thundercloud, whatever, I start small. I start fixing things small. Usually, I just make my bed. And then I clean my room, I clean my desk, just little things restoring my sense of competency. Because, hey, if I can do this, well, maybe I can do this. And if I can do that, well, maybe I can go out there and do this and just, build myself back up until I'm ready to tackle that problem head on. Whereas if I just sort of attempted to jump straight into it, I have no sense of competency. I'm not going to be as an effective fighter, so to speak, as, if I do my little things to build myself back up. So men will eventually exit the cave once their sense of competency is restored. Now, uniquely, there exists, hopefully, and there should exist for everyone, which will be the moral of the story, an inner circle of trusted male friends. Well, they don't necessarily have to be male, but they often are. A trusted inner circle of friends who can be relied upon, who will be allowed to enter the cave after the man. And this probably takes the form of your best friends and this sort of thing, potentially close family members and this sort of thing. Now, they can't go right to the depths of the cave. They can't follow you relentlessly. They can merely present themselves at the entrance of this metaphorical cave and say, hey, I'm here if you need anything. It's not the same case with women. Obviously, women are very different to men, behaviorally speaking. I mean, we're more similar than different, but there are several profound behavioral differences that need to be taken into account here. Obviously, when we're dealing with women being upset, it's a completely different case, but this is men. We're talking about men here. So the inner circle will be allowed to come into the mouth of the cave and present themselves as being available to help. And if the man is willing, he'll say, hey, come in here, I'm having this problem, let's talk about it, let's have an open discussion, and you can encourage me and help me build up my sense of competency. Because there's a couple ways to build up a sense of competency, obviously. You can, do things in real life to prove to yourself that you can do stuff, and you can hear the words of your friends and they can remind you about things you've done in the past and how much they think about you and how much they value you and this sort of thing. And obviously that boosts your sense of competency as well, and that can help you be willing to come out of the cave. So I think this is where this is where society as a whole, government programs, campaigns, and this sort of thing fall flat, because all this sort of stuff, saying we're here to help, why don't men do this, encourage men to speak out and this sort of thing, I believe it's seen as an attack on male competency, and it only serves to drive people who are upset further into the cave. Because despite the fact that you have, fire hoses of government money and lots of well-meaning, again, this is all well-intentioned, well-meaning, charities, causes, and this sort of thing, most men aren't receptive to that sort of thing. So what I believe is, again, this is just my opinion, would be helpful, if not an outright solution, but a helpful hand towards ending the disastrous rate of male suicide in Australia, is we have to allow men to form close brotherhoods, close circles, even if these brotherhoods and circles, and especially if they do this, especially if they choose to exclude people. Because I find that what we see nowadays is that any group of men who's seeming to sort of gang up and form their own little tribe, their own little brotherhood and this sort of thing, it's frowned upon. It's seen as, if not outright called misogynistic, it's seen as exclusive, borderline misogynistic. It's not tolerated, is what I'm trying to get across. Society doesn't tolerate men ganging up. And societies have never tolerated men ganging up together, because when men gang up together, they're able to share ideas and essentially, or whether violently or non-violently, change society. And there are a lot of people who are in society at the moment, and they like the way things are going, and they benefit enormously from the way society is run, and they don't want it to change. So when they see men ganging up, and this has happened many times throughout history, the Roman Empire was started by men ganging up in Italy and deciding they wanted to change the way things were. A large part of the Renaissance within Europe, the sort of liberal movements within Europe, was men ganging up in coffee shops and discussing ideas, frank and open discussion, as I've chatted about in the channel before, and they ended up bringing about, increased rights for the citizenship and this sort of thing. This is obviously not tolerated by the orthodoxy at the time. So I believe we have an orthodoxy right now, 21st century Western world, that again, like every other orthodoxy throughout history, views men ganging up as something to be feared. Because we're worried we're going to have a frank and open discussion and say, look, we don't like the way things are run, we would like to change them. And again, this threatens lots and lots of people who have a lot to gain from the way things are run. So I think that's why male suicide, as it is in Australia, is such an epidemic problem. Men are not allowed to form close brotherhoods that are allowed to exclude others, where they can exchange ideas, have frank and open discussions, and trust one another. Because if men aren't allowed to trust one another, well, you can't enter the cave without trust. Now, speaking from my own personal experience, and again, this isn't indicative of everything that goes on in the world, maybe you've experienced something similar, I recently joined a Discord. And in this Discord, despite the fact that these are people from all over the world who I don't know at all, I don't even know their names because we're all using usernames and this sort of thing. I've barely been there any time at all. I don't know these people that well. Because there exists this bond of trust between us, this implicit bond of trust, by my presence alone indicates that I am trusted. People are perfectly willing to share their inner feelings with me. Now this stands in stark contrast to the narrative or what men are like. The narrative of what men are like is that men are stoic, stiff upper-lipped, they just refuse to share their problems with anyone. This simply isn't true. It's a mythology. I don't know why that this is put into place. Maybe it's just an easy explanation for these numbers I've talked about. But if men are allowed to form a brotherhood, if men are allowed to form an inner circle whose principal element is trust, men are perfectly willing and perfectly acceptable to be open and honest with one another. They're perfectly willing to share feelings. These people, who I don't know that well, and they don't know me that well, perfectly willing to share what's going wrong in their lives, how they're feeling, and all this sort of thing. So imagine the power, imagine the lives that could be saved, that could be unleashed upon the world if we simply encouraged, not merely tolerated, but encouraged men to gang up, exclude others that they see fit to exclude, and form bonds of trust. Again, the reason why that this is happening, or isn't allowed to happen, is because men ganging up and forming bonds of trust and discussing things is how societies change. And a lot of people at this moment have a lot to gain from society continuing the way that it is. It comes down to money, it comes down to power, and unfortunately it's a road to the future that's paved with the gravestones of men. And again, just reading in from Australia, the age 15 to 44 bracket, which does include me, it may include you, it may include most of your friend group. The biggest killer of men aged 15 to 44 in Australia is suicide. And this suicide, I believe, is perpetuated by a society that doesn't allow men to gang up and trust one another. It's what It's what men are meant to do. It's what we're biologically programmed to do. We can't just get rid of these evolutionary drives as much as we'd like to. We can't get rid of these evolutionary drives just with social campaigns and the fire hose of government money. This is something I believe we're doing in many other aspects of our life. We can't get rid of our desire to gorge. We can't get rid of our desire to have lots of sex. It can't be done. These aren't conditions that we can cure as of yet, unless we're going to get into genetic engineering and this sort of thing. Potentially hypnotherapy, but I don't know. These aren't things that we can cure. These aren't things that are going to go away. These are things that we have to manage. It's like a disease that we don't have the vaccine for yet. It's just something that comes around, it's present, and it's something that we have to deal with. Ignoring it or refusing any kind of treatment to take place is going to only exacerbate the problem. And this is what we're seeing with male suicide. Hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, potentially millions of years of evolution, cannot be outdone, cannot be undone through the fire hose of government money and public spending and campaign social awareness and this sort of thing. There is a biological imperative that lies in the heart of every man, and to ignore it makes you complicit in their suicide. You didn't pull the trigger, you didn't do what was done, but by refusing to let men gang up and speak to one another, you are complicit in their demise.